Eric Feinstein, Northwell Ventures. Northwell Ventures is the corporate venture arm of Northwell Health. Northwell Health is one of the largest integrated health systems if you're from New York, the New York area. We have 23 hospitals with research affiliations, about 650 in the ambulatory and outpatient centers, skilled nursing, rehabilitation, research, managed care, and then Northwell Ventures is the for-profit arm of the health system. I'll try to keep it sort of brief at that. We do sort of 4 key things within Northwell Ventures. We have our direct equity investment arm, which is our venture platform. We have our new innovation, new company creation practice, which is taking non-core assets and creating business models around them from internally generated intellectual property. 3, we have this what we call our corporate carve-out and divestiture business, which is taking non-core assets. These are large private equity types of transactions and carving them out of the health system. And then 4th is our, actually I'll leave it with that.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kelly Kreinick. I'm with Mayo Clinic Ventures, which is part of the Department of Business Development at Mayo Clinic. Mayo Clinic is a large hospital system. We have 3 sites, the primary site being in Rochester, Minnesota, which is where I'm from. We also have satellite sites in Jacksonville, Florida, Scottsdale, Arizona, and then our 60 health system sites, which are community hospital and clinics, mostly in the Midwest. All told, it's about 63,000 employees spread among those institutions, or among those sites, I should say. And we see about 1.3 million patients last year. There he is. From every state in the union and about 135 countries outside of the U.S. Our office has a collection of seed funds that we manage. They're all from different funding sources, so our smallest seed program is funded through an allocation of our revenue through our royalty activities based on licensing of Mayo's intellectual property. And that can fund up to $200,000 investments when we are collaborating with outside companies. All of our funds, from the smallest seed fund that I just mentioned to our largest, which is our venture co-investment fund, require there be an IP or strategic connection to Mayo Clinic, so a relationship outside of the funding. And my job as a business development manager within the department is to facilitate those transactions. Our venture co-investment fund, as I mentioned, obviously requires a co-investment, usually alongside of a blue chip financial VC, and that can be up to $3 million of investment, usually tranched, although we do rarely also have the opportunity to follow on with growth capital.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So I'm Rick Gordon. I'm a director at the Inova Personalized Health Accelerator. Inova is a health system located in Northern Virginia. We're 17,000 employees, about 4,000 physicians. I think we treat 2 million patients annually. In addition to many sort of ambulatory clinics, we have 5 large hospitals that we operate in that Northern Virginia region. Inova 2 years ago started a corporate venture activity called Inova Strategic Investments that I'm also a part of. ISI is a $150 million balance sheet commitment from the health system. We are generally stage agnostic, so we will, of course, with our accelerator, invest in pre-seed deals. We'll lead those. We'll lead seed deals. We will follow in Series A and later. We've written checks as big as $5 million, as long as the round is strategically relevant to the hospital system and has a strong venture lead. We consider the later stage deals. Of the $150 million, we also have invested in 5 other funds that helps us get visibility into innovation outside of our health system so that we can insert it in. It also provides a nice consortium of later stage investors for us to take out the deals that we're seeding for follow-on investment. The kinds of investments that we like are generally capital efficient. So what that means to us is we love software deals, whether it's health IT or digital health. We will do medical devices as long as they're class 1 or class 2. We have not done a class 3. Would consider them, but it would have to be a risk mitigated regulatory pathway. And we do select pharmaceuticals. We have not done biotech and probably will not.
And I'm Lauren Brugan. I'm a principal at the Heritage Group. The Heritage Group is structured as a private equity fund. It's about a $220 million fund, and we're investing out of our second fund. We are not associated with a hospital system, but our LPs are all strategic. So we have about 15 LPs. We have major hospital systems like Intermountain and Adventist. We have about 7 Blues plans, and we have some other healthcare strategics like Cerner and Amedisys. We are a little bit on the later stage. I mean, we will do Series A, but typically it's Series B and above, and our check size is somewhere between 10 to 20 million. We invest mainly in healthcare IT, we'll do digital health, and services. We don't do drug development, and so far have not done much in the med device space. And our structure of our fund is interesting in that our LPs actually sit on our investment committee. So we have a rotating group of some of the hospital system executives or someone from our PRs, and they will actually serve as our investment committee. And we rotate that out every year so that other people within their organizations get a chance to sit on our IC.
Terrific. Thank you, Lauren. And I'm Brent Stackhouse. I work here in New York City at the Mount Sinai Health System. We're an 8 hospital system, about $8 billion in revenue. Mount Sinai Ventures invests in early stage seed and Series A companies. We both do care delivery as well as digital health, medical devices, and the like. We are similar to Inova, are not in the biotech space. Mount Sinai does have a tech transfer office, which works very closely in that, but that is not the purview of my fund. We invest off the balance sheet, so fund is something of a misnomer. We've had about 22 investments, valued somewhere around $50 million. I am honored to have the opportunity to sit with so many distinguished guests. I love the fact that I came from the closest and yet was the last here. The Redefining Early Stage Investment Conference has really been a great opportunity for all of us to get together and meet. I know Kelly and I met here maybe 1 or 2 years ago, and it's a great opportunity for, I think, all of you to have an opportunity to hear from strategic investors about what it is that is needed in order to be able to have success with our institutions. So before we get going here, I was curious to understand from the audience's standpoint, who here is an entrepreneur, works for a startup company, is raising money, is looking to make an impact in one of our health systems? All right, terrific. And of you who are entrepreneurs, who of you are doing business currently with one of the hospitals represented here with the Department of Heritage? All right, so there's a lot of learnings to be had. And anyone here an investor? Terrific. You're all investors as well. Interesting. Okay. So I think one of the things that we were hoping to sort of convey through this panel to all of you is sort of the tips and tricks of how to navigate our health systems. They're big, they're bureaucratic, they're tricky, sometimes mercurial. I could keep going. It is a Monday and it's raining. So one of the things that I found at Mount Sinai Health System is the absolute need to find a strong strategic partner within the institution, and that the politics are very tricky, that you might think you're dealing with somebody who's a chief of a division, but it turns out we have many chiefs. They may not actually have what's needed in terms of sort of political capital or even actual capital to be able to make an impact on your company, be able to actually make an investment or to be able to bring your company sort of through the contracting process. And so turning to the panel here, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me, something of a differentiator between some of us, is whether or not we require the institution to be able to share in intellectual property. And my understanding from Kelly was that at Mayo, that is absolutely essential. And so I'm curious for the other, and so I was curious for the other members of the panel, where is that advantageous? Where is your recommendation that your entrepreneurs come into the institution, find someone to co-develop with, so that your institution has sort of a stake in that intellectual property as well? Eric, do you want to take that?
Sure. I'll break that into my answer to 2 parts. From a venture perspective, bringing a venture deal from the external into Northwell Ventures doesn't require, and I'll repeat, doesn't require co-development. So we have invested in a number of businesses in our portfolio that are working exceptionally well, and could continue to do so. So we fund it just like Heritage. We'll fund the business, and it's more of a growth equity round. The other side is looking at businesses, and I would say if you're not doing that, you're not harnessing the potential of strategic investors. So we do a lot of co-development work with our businesses that we do bring in from the outside. and help them develop and iterate on the product. Think of us like an outsourced product development shop, if you will. For that time, materials, energy, and effort, we will get an additional piece of equity. And again, I would say if you're a company and you're not harnessing that from your strategic investors, then you're leaving quite a bit of value on the table. The second piece to the answer is that if this is a more of internal intellectual property, and we bring somebody in from the outside, it is very challenging to navigate sort of the internal politics with the external politics. So that happens less often. But I would say it's not a necessary prerequisite to enter into the Northwell Ventures environment.
Rick, any thoughts on this? Coming from the Innova system?
So if any of you know Innova, you probably know Innova is not really incredibly well known for the research that we do internally. There's just not a lot of it. And I think that's one of the reasons that we exist. Innova is sort of transforming from what were generally 5 stovepiped hospital systems into a single system. And I think management wants to imbue the system with a more innovative culture. So principally, our focus is to do that from discovering innovation on the outside and driving it into our system. So in the early stages, what that typically means is that if we're making investments, it's always coming from outside of the system. But we are a strategic fund, so what generally that means is I can't make the investment in a company unless there's advocacy from within the system. So from a clinical perspective, there has to be a need and an early adopter inside the system. So for seed and pre-seed investments and potentially Series A investments before the, I'll just say before the technologies are generally available, what that will typically translate into is a commitment to do a clinical trial, a commitment to do a pilot or an alpha or beta early on for those companies. And so, but in every case, we don't make claims on the intellectual property that might be co-developed.
So for Innova, Northwell, and Mount Sinai, it sounds like we all have sort of a similar perspective on this. I'm curious, for the limited partners in the Heritage Plan, do you see many companies coming through where the limited partner has intellectual property, or is that actually a conflict? Does that cause an issue with the fund?
I don't think it would be a conflict, but we've never seen that happen so far. The companies that we invest in, one of our health systems might be working with them, but typically not in a co-development sort of capacity. They're oftentimes coming, from outside the systems entirely, where we find an interesting investment opportunity. And while it's not required that these companies that we invest in have customer relationships with our LPs, we obviously prefer that. We are looking for companies and opportunities that are going to have some strategic value to our LPs. So if they're not working with our LPs and our LPs are not interested in working with them, then that kind of gives us our answer in terms of whether we want to invest or not. So the way our process often works is, as we're doing diligence on a company and we get further along, we will bring that management team around to, say, 3 to 5 of our LPs and get our LP feedback. And typically during that process, they start going through some of the early stages of becoming a customer. So we've certainly invested in businesses that are not working with any of our LPs. But as we're getting closer to closing, they are starting to get closer to entering into customer relationships. So we kind of track that internally, and over the course of our 2 funds, we have been a part of having 60 customer contracts signed between our LPs and our portfolio companies.
Right, that's helpful. So, Kelly, understanding that Mayo is looking internally to be able to find opportunities, how do you go about identifying sort of which market segments to be prioritizing? I mean, you must be inundated with entrepreneurs internally. You guys have a massive platform. How do you pick and choose what you're excited about? Is it voice? Is it chatbot, which some people might say is the same thing? Is it women's health? How do you make those decisions?
So just a point of clarification. In the about 170 portfolio companies that we have based on our collection of seed funds, some of which are quite small, about 100 of those companies are actually outside companies that have access to some form of Mayo intellectual property. So we don't necessarily spin out companies ourselves as a requirement. We certainly do that. But we can have an IP-based or strategic relationship with outside companies who have the foundational IP already, where we're contributing, much like Eric said, to add value to that in some way. We don't actually have a ton of entrepreneurs in Rochester, Minnesota. As surprising and shocking as that might be, it's really not the hub for entrepreneurism, although we're working on it. And so basically, in terms of how we define where we look for opportunities, it's where our clinicians identify unmet needs that they find intriguing solutions for in the marketplace. Either they develop them themselves, and we have strong IP, we decide to fund those internally and then spin them out when an entrepreneur finds them appealing and wants to work on that for the next 5 to 8 years of their lives. Or we find companies that have solutions that our clinical staff or researchers really find interesting, and we'll develop a relationship with the company and then choose to evaluate funding it from there as well.
So it sounds like it's purely opportunistic.
Largely, yes. I mean, certainly Mayo has strategic areas of priority.
What are some of those?
Cardiovascular, neurosurgery, connected care, things like that, but we're hardly limited by that. We may take a closer look at some of those things, but I think it's fair to say we're fairly opportunistic.
And so flipping back to Lauren here, with Heritage, how are you identifying what priorities are of your limited partners?
So we have 2 people on our team whose full-time job is to travel around the country and meet with our LPs. So they really try to meet with individuals across all the different groups, so they really understand what the strategic imperatives are for our LPs, where they're spending their time, both their time and their money over the next year, and that really informs our investment thesis. We are opportunistic, so we collect all that information across our LP base, but if we see a company that we think is a great investment opportunity, and maybe doesn't fall very clearly within those buckets of areas that we've been looking based upon this LP feedback, we will still do the work to figure out if it makes sense from an investment standpoint. And then a part of that work will be taking that company to our LPs and seeing if there is interest.
And are there any specific priorities right now that you all are focused on?
Yeah, right now we're spending a lot of time on different at-risk provider models. So we're looking at primary care, we're looking at the Medicare Advantage market, and we're looking at condition-specific. So being able to carve out a certain population and care for those individuals on behalf of our payers.
And do all of your limited partners take risk?
No.
Okay,
They
so
don't.
some of them are
Yeah,
strictly
so
in the fee-for-service world
They
still.
are, yeah. And so when you look across, obviously we have a bunch of payers, but when you look across our hospital LP base, it's kind of a mix. We've got some who are really kind of on the forefront of thinking about how they are going to take on more risk, want to be involved in PPCI, and then we have some that are just much more of a fee-for-service, mindset and haven't switched over. So for us, as investors, we do have a pretty wide area and range in which we can invest because we cover a lot of areas within healthcare. We've got Cerner, we've got some healthcare IT, we have payers, we have hospital systems, and across those hospital systems, each of them have a slightly different mindset and a slightly different focus.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, I know Northwell certainly takes risks. Mount Sinai is an increasing panel of allocated lives. Inova,
Early. It's
early,
really early for us.
and Mayo, this is your bread and butter.
Yeah.
All right. So, Rick, tell us, at Inova, what are the strategic priorities and how are you identifying what you're targeting from an investment standpoint?
So I'm a lot like Heritage. I think we have our strategic priorities. Women's health, of course, is a major issue for us, heart and vascular cancer. But at the end of the day, we're a double bottom line fund, and I spend as much time thinking about strategic fit as I do about getting top quartile venture returns. And so that just really leads us to being as opportunistic as we can be. We're looking for good good opportunities in high growth segments that can return a really great return to our fund.
And Eric, how does it vary at Northwell compared to Inova?
Yeah, it's very similar. Every deal that we do has to have strategic fit as well as, again, underwriting for strategic return and financial return. Every single transaction. We are institutional investors at the end of the day. I mean, we lead our transactions. We work with our companies like Heritage does. But every deal that we do get into has to fit and enable the mission and strategy of Northwell Health in some way, shape, or form. So we are opportunistic when transactions come up. We do have specified investment themes that we do target on an annual basis.
What are some of those right now?
Hospital-acquired infections are a big one. We've developed an investment thesis, and we do have a portfolio company specifically in that space, and we we've got a broader investment thesis of how to attack HAIs. We have another one in the connected health space, digital health strategy. We have another one in women's health and artificial intelligence, and then we have another one on the lab side for automating pathology.
So Sinai is actually a little more opportunistic, and I think similar to Mayo, sort of, catch as catch can. I will say, though, that the thing that I've been really focusing more on is less around clinical and consumer-focused solutions, more around sort of business-to-business solutions, just because I find that they're easier to get diligence done. It's easier to identify an internal stakeholder who can invest time in helping shepherd that company. And I think our institutional leadership that's sitting on the board of Mount Sinai Ventures has an easier time wrapping their head around, revenue cycle management, supply chain, procurement, things that are a little less risky than at least sort of the clinical or the consumer side. So Eric, I'm going to go back to you for a second here. Where have you seen an entrepreneur just fail, just crash and burn at Northwell? Where did they go wrong?
Business or process?
Either.
There's
We're trying to explain to our audience here, where they can try to avoid some of the pitfalls that you've witnessed others succumb to.
Well, so then I'll answer that in both process and business/product fit. Product, you've got to have sort of a product or a service that aligns, again, with the mission and strategy of Northwell. So it has to fit some unmet need. Keep in mind on that front, if you are going in a competitive, crowded marketplace, you are trying to displace either a vendor that we already use today. There are some costs to, there are actually some costs to us as a health system. That's one. Two, there are real costs, and I'll use HIT as an example, of, say, integration. Yeah, I mean, you may think, hey, this is just, a simple integration into your HIE. Call it a couple $100,000 of real cost that we have to take on to do that. So things are not always as easy as people ultimately assume. So that's the product. You have to have that sort of that fit. Process. I can tell you, people feel like they just want to blanket sort of the organization. That's the wrong way to do it.
Explain what you mean when you say blanket.
So they'll send us, an entrepreneur will send us a pitch deck and they'll say, hey, come and look. Maybe they haven't gotten a response. It's like, just so everyone on the entrepreneurial side is clear, even on the investors out there, it's like drinking from the fire hose. We get pitched, and I'm sure this is for everyone here, we get pitched 20 plus ideas on a weekly basis. I mean, it's crazy. So if we don't respond to you, apologize, we will. Just be persistent. But then they'll send us a deck, then they'll send a clinician, then they'll send our chief operating officer, and then they'll send our CEO. At the end of the day, it always filters back down to us. And I can tell you, your surest way to aggravate and kill your chances is by trying to skirt around the people that you see sort of at the front door. And if you do finally get a response, and it's sort of a soft response, hey, it's probably not the right fit, because again, we all have sort of investment theses, or maybe it's not the right, economic, profile, or we can't find a clinical stakeholder. Whatever the reason may be, if the answer is, hey, let's hold off for right now, don't try and skirt and go around that by going to our chief operating officer or a CEO. You're going to kill every chance that you have to get in the door, maybe 6 months down the road. So take that answer again with a grain of salt. It's temporary. It may change, because I know everyone here, everyone is pretty direct and transparent with sort of feedback, and I think that's relatively universal across the whole provider spectrum.
Kelly, straight to the CEO. Is that the way to do it at Mayo?
Yeah, no. Although that does happen, and Eric's right, it does eventually get filtered down to us anyway, so it makes much more sense to work with us directly and make sure that if you have something interesting, it gets in front of the right eyes, and the CEO is generally not that person. For us, it's really about finding that clinical partner, and so a lot of entrepreneurs and companies will go straight to the KOL or the person they want to work with, and in some instances that works fine because those investigators are, educated enough and experienced enough to know when to raise their hand to come to us to facilitate putting an agreement in place and defining the relationship. Other times, the clinician or the investigator isn't that experienced or familiar with the various paths available to him or her. And so it ends up languishing in, discussions and, sort of informal consulting, if you will, that doesn't really benefit the company and is certainly not going to lead to an investment from us. So getting to the right door, which I know can be challenging. We've heard from folks who've tried to get to our office and without knowing the name of it and, talking to various people. And it takes sometimes, a lot of time and persistence to get to the right door, but it is important that you do that if you want to consider a strategic investment from Mayo and I'm sure from groups like Northwell and Sinai and others. So getting to the right office is important, and so stay persistent in that.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, for Rick and Lauren, is there anything that you would add?
So, just, since there's so many investors in the group, maybe I'm preaching to the choir, but we're all really busy people. I mean, I can tell you, I have a queue of deals that we like that's 40 companies deep, and that it becomes a sort of organic process of, which ones rise to the top, and just to be candid, we're always doing deals, and so if I'm in the middle of a deal, I'm not doing your deal, and so timing matters, right? So, but we've said it already. Just be persistent, be patient. Don't put above me, right?
Now, Lauren, slightly different structure,
It is,
being that you're
yeah.
sitting with limited partners who they're trying to get direct access to. Are you a gateway for those limited partners?
Yes and no. I mean, some of our limited partners have, even their own venture arm. So, no, I don't really view us as a gateway. We don't have a situation where, an entrepreneur comes to us, sends us a deck, and then goes around us and goes straight to our LPs. That just doesn't happen, and if it does, we don't hear about it. So that's not really a concern for us.
And so what is the best way to enter your organization? Do you have formal application process? Is there a website that you go to and you fill out a form and then it gets sort of queued?
For us, no, we don't really have a website where it gets queued. Typically, an entrepreneur is just gonna, reach out to us over LinkedIn or, have someone's email address and send a pitch across and try to schedule a meeting. So that's typically how, you get into the Heritage Group. It's between that and its conferences. We're at most of the major healthcare conferences, whether it's JP Morgan or HIMSS or, Health or, any of them. So that's typically how deals come for us.
Do any of you have a formal application process?
We do.
What's it look
I
like?
mean, we ask for a business plan. I mean, it's not like, we have an accelerator vehicle, an accelerator program as well. And, certainly we get a lot of inbounds from that. But, I'd say if I looked across the number of deals that we looked at this year, about a third maybe came through the website. The rest are coming from referrals, and the best deals are always coming from other investors or just service providers in our neighborhood.
Yeah, we do have a website with all of our contact information on it, so the business development folks would probably be the best point of call from the website. We did actually create a process, which I think we used for perhaps 2-3 months. And
Is that good, huh?
Yeah, well, and we created it out of the fact that folks would go to the CEO or the CAO and, send ideas over that way, and then they would get filtered to us and we'd have no information. So we created an intake form primarily for those instances where, we didn't really know the company, it came from, some other source, and we hadn't had a chance to see the deck, so we, are basically soliciting information via the form, and we have a process to review those because we get so many. But I would say that really the best way is just to reach out to our office directly, via email is probably the easiest, with a pitch deck and some information, and then if it seems interesting, we can schedule a call. That usually is followed by a discussion, if it's interesting, with somebody on our clinical side or our research side, wherever the relevant potential partner would be, to see if there's an interest, a mutual interest there in, proceeding to come up with a development plan of some sort.
I want to make one comment to a point that Kelly mentioned about 5 minutes ago around clinicians. Kelly said sometimes clinicians are great, sometimes they're not. You make our job infinitely easier if you already have a clinical stakeholder and the system is purchasing a product. So if it progresses all the way through procurement, if you as an entrepreneur and as a company and product get through procurement, which is like the black box, one of the worst parts of our organization. If you get through that,
The great people, though.
you automatically have credibility. So, but as an entrepreneur, I caution you, don't get into the spot that Kelly mentioned where you start talking to a clinician, they provide sort of this informal consultative advice. Maybe they've got some ulterior motives of raising your advisory board, and you don't really get anywhere. Pick and choose the right clinician stakeholder, and if they are the right person that can navigate you through before you come to one of us on the venture side, our jobs are infinitely easier.
So Eric, how do you identify a good stakeholder internally? How do you know you're dealing with somebody who's legit?
As an entrepreneur, I would look for a couple of things. One, how much credibility did they have in their respective space? So how many publications have they written? Do they have a national sort of reputation in a particular area of expertise? Do they seem to be active sort of on the public speaking circuit, research, et cetera? And then lastly, if you've had 15 conversations with them and hey, you really haven't advanced, it's a pretty sure bet that they're probably not your best advocate, and try to kind of broaden that clinical stakeholder set. Guide yourself by sort of action and execution versus, as an entrepreneur, versus what they say they will do.
Yeah,
How do you find a stakeholder, Kelly?
Well, I find it interesting too that sometimes entrepreneurs or early stage companies want to have a relationship with the KOL whose name is recognized everywhere. But for us, where we're requiring some sort of relationship between the investigator and the company, those KOLs don't always have the time, the bandwidth, or the interest in providing that type of direct feedback and working with the company in a real way. And so to suggest that you're only going to work with a particular KOL because that's the name you think you want associated with your company is not necessarily the way to get the most value. There might be, a secondary person who is mentored by the KOL, who's got time, energy, and is willing to bring the feedback that's informed by the KOL, but is actually going to be able to do the work that you need done to advance your product or your service.
So our environment is so totally different than your environment. I've spent some time at Mayo, and I've never been around a culture that was so intellectually curious at a hospital than what you guys have. And so it's interesting how, that perspective, we're just 180 hour. We do have, we have a fellows program, and they're generally the thought leaders within, our physician community, clinician community. And
Your fellows are employees of Inova who you've identified to be sort of thought leaders and good potential
So it
partners.
started out as us identifying who they were, but in general, the rock stars know the rock stars, and so that's generally how we think about hospital systems, think about them, and so we've leveraged the relationships that our fellows have had with other leaders in the industry that they're known as early adopters, they're known as being intellectually curious, willing to work with a startup, and so that's how we've identified them. But it's it's not a huge list for us. Not like
And Lauren, with Heritage?
I don't think the question is quite as relevant for us. I mean, one thing I was thinking through as everyone else spoke was that my prior fund, we spent about half of our time in healthcare and reserved a small portion of that to really do some earlier stage investments, and some of that could be in drug development or med tech. And one thing that always really helped for that small sliver of our portfolio is to be able to surround yourself with those rock stars. So when we looked at their strategic advisory board, if they were able to put together the leaders within their space and their niche, that really spoke volumes. And it would go from getting a pitch deck, seeing it saying this is too early stage for us, no, to seeing that strategic advisory board or board of directors slide and being able to recognize, okay, these are the rock stars within their space, to suddenly being a yes, we would like to take a meeting. And so who you surround yourselves and being able to find those thought leaders and get them behind what you're doing can really make or break a situation from an investor standpoint.
So sort of synthesizing some information that you all shared, from the Sinai perspective, I will say, if you are going directly to the C-suite, it usually causes me to reevaluate your proposal with something of a jaundiced eye, because there's so much sensitivity right now around conflicts of interest that exist between members of executive leadership, boards of trustees, and some of what we saw happen at Memorial Sloan Kettering over the last couple months. So when it comes to finding a key opinion leader, stakeholder for you to partner with within your institution, one of the things that I think is really important to be careful about is offering some sort of compensation, be it equity or some other structure. Because ultimately what you might find yourself doing is putting yourself in a conflict where you're actually going to be precluding your company from being able to move forward in the implementation process. And I saw this firsthand at Sinai. There was a startup company came through a local incubator, approached sort of the key person within a particular clinical department. In order for their product to be implemented, this person had to be at the table at every single meeting. They then gave that person equity and made them an advisor to the company. So then that individual, that clinician or physician brought that to conflict of interest. They said, yep, take your equity. Now you need to recuse yourself from any dealings with this company. So now the entrepreneur, the solution is sitting there with somebody on their cap table with equity who cannot participate in any of the discussion around implementation, co-development, or procurement. So they just lost the exact person that they needed. And it was such just shot themselves in the foot in the process. And we still have a contract with them and we've yet to implement. And it's been 3 years now. I mean, it's remarkable. And so I think I can't advise enough to be very cautious. I think, Erica, you were the one who said this, around incenting someone to want to participate within your organization from an advisor or consultative role. The other thing that I think is really important, I've seen this happen at Sinai, is sort of death by pilot. And groups will come in, they'll find a key opinion leader, they'll find a stakeholder, they'll start piloting with that individual's team, and then that person will get busy. There'll be a flu outbreak, or they move to a different hospital, or some other priority hits their radar, and that project is no longer at the forefront of their attention. And then as a result, the pilot starts to sit there and wane. And so I think it's also important, as advice to the entrepreneurs in the audience, is to find multiple stakeholders who support your solution, because there is a good chance that who you're working with today is not going to be there 12, 18, or 24 months from now.
Can I add one last point to that? On the clinical stakeholder side, and this is for the entrepreneurs and even the investment folks, think about your clinical stakeholders as folks that are senior enough and are business savvy enough to understand sort of the bigger picture. Too many times I see really scientific clinicians that understand the science really well. What they don't understand is how that translates, one, to business, and two, how that affects the broader enterprise strategy. So at Northwell, a digital connected consumer is a really political hot button topic. If we have a clinician that really likes a particular product, I can tell you there's 25 other competing solutions that may be in different forms of pilot, consultative discussions, etc. What we have done, and the reason why we made an investment in one particular product, was that it had applicability and scalability across the broad platform. So we're taking the 30,000-foot view as an executive to say, does this fit, yes, this need, but does it also translate to this need, this need, and this need? Most clinicians, and I'm going to use a real-life example for you, in the orthopedic side, people were looking at CJR, and they were looking at a very specific product for CJR. It did something very well in the CJR side, but it was only applicable for orthopedics. We invested in a company that had that, but it was broader applicability and scalability throughout the entire organization. So be mindful of who you interact with and pressure test that clinician that they have that sort of broad enterprise perspective thinking, and you'll find the execs and senior clinicians that sort of have that level of thinking.
Jumping off that point for a second, the other thing I think is important is that when you are looking for your key stakeholder internally, is to actually get references from other people within that institution. Although they may seem like a rock star on paper, they might have lots of publications, they may be speaking at lots of conferences, they may have zero political capital because of the internal politics of an institution, and you will never know that. And so I think as an entrepreneur, it's turning to your board of advisors, your board members, and asking them for other touch points within the institution to sort of feel out, hey, what do you know about this person? What is the sentiment around them within their team? I want to go back to the concept of piloting. I always hear sort of mixed opinions about this, and I'm going to start with Lauren. Do you see those entrepreneurs who are piloting at your limited partners as having sort of the appropriate way of finding investment opportunities within Heritage, or do you find that the pilot process sort of extends or delays the eventual investment opportunity?
You know, it seems pretty obvious, but we prefer a customer contract, right? I mean, we have, too many times seen companies come through to us, for investment, and they're piloting with one of our LPs, and they end up not, making it through, the procurement process to become an actual customer. And so for us, having a pilot with one of our LPs is better than not having a pilot or a customer relationship. But it's not a huge differentiator for us. I mean, we would need, it's just a higher bar, right? So if you're going through a pilot with one of our LPs, we're going to need to spend, more time with that LP to understand, what they're looking for, what the endpoints are, how they're viewing success, and get some sense of real excitement from, the department that is piloting.
Rick?
For every pre-seed and seed deal, it's part of the process. If it's a software, it's not likely that I'm going to take a pre-series A company and get a contract for at that point from Inova, but it is likely that if it's a valuable capability, we can get a commitment for a pilot. That's part of our due diligence.
And are you paying for that pilot?
So varies. It varies. In general, I think our expectation, our anchor position is no. But we're flexible there.
Now, Mayo, you have an entire infrastructure built around this.
Well, certainly we do many clinical trials at Mayo, all stages, pilot included, but that's not a requirement for us, particularly with our earliest seed program. We're very early with those, sometimes building, the second version of the prototype, obviously nowhere near ready for a pilot. But from our co-investment fund, a pilot, again, is not required, and Mayo is slow to adopt technology, so that's rarely an instance where we'll be a customer, just to be honest. But piloting, certainly would be an advantage if you were a little bit later stage, like co-investment type. We will fund the first clinical trial. We do have a seed fund that's supported through philanthropy that's specific to clinical stage technologies, where we can bring up to $2 million to support a clinical trial. So that's also an option, but we do need that co-development relationship prior to that stage.
And now, have you seen successful pilots get converted into investments, or do you find that oftentimes those pilots sort of cause your potential investment opportunities to flounder?
I'm actually thinking about this one hard. We do a little over 6,000 clinical trials on an annual basis throughout the organization. But, and I'm going to answer your question, but getting to the conflict of interest statement that you made, we can't take equity for a clinical trial that we are working on.
What about after it's complete?
After it's completed, sure. But during the clinical trial process, we can't. I don't think we have had any pilots come through our Northwell Ventures portfolio that were pilots before that we then invested in. Every investment that we've made, we've actually forced a pilot to occur. One portfolio company that I can think of was actually all the way through the procurement process. So to answer your question, I don't believe so.
So Sinai is similar in that way, and I think one of the reasons for that is that when pilots are being done sort of casually, if you will, I think there are a couple of issues. I mean, the first one is that innovation really isn't incentivized at our health system. People are not paid to be innovative. They're paid to be doctors, they're paid to do research, they're paid to teach. So this is something they do on the side, and as a result, it often gets sort of third or fourth billing in terms of priorities and pecking order. And oftentimes, those pilots that are created between the entrepreneur and the key stakeholder, sort of off to the side, aren't structured well. So by the time it comes to my group, I'm distrustful that it was actually a well-done process and I can actually believe what the outcomes were. And so generally it gets often written off rather than something that my group helped structure, where we're putting key performance indicators in, clear metrics for success. And then I think most importantly, and if there's any advice I can give, I think is remotely valuable to the audience here, is that at the end of the pilot, there's a clear conversion, that language is in an agreement that if the pilot's successful and hits the metrics, it will then go through procurement and become a contract. It will become a longer term, broader scoped agreement.
And that's how we stop.
No, Kelly's no, that's wrong.
That does not work for us at all, yeah.
That's how we actually stop the get into pilot phase and this no man's land, do a pilot and it doesn't go anywhere. As an investment, obviously as an investor, I want to make sure that you don't get into that as a company. So we want to make sure that there is specific language around conduct the pilot. If it meets certain endpoints, and these are rigorous endpoints, then it will go into procurement. And that's a really key piece. If it doesn't meet the endpoints, obviously we want to understand that as an investment and fail fast. And hopefully we've structured the deal in an appropriate way that we're not putting all of our capital at risk.
Kelly, where are we going wrong?
Well, I think for, digital solutions where the pilot is to try something within the system, that's a more reasonable approach. It's still difficult within our system given the breadth of activities and even doing a healthcare IT related pilot that requires IT bandwidth, particularly since we just went through the Epic conversion. I mean, that's gonna be difficult at Mayo, to be honest. But you can do it within certain departments if you're not, connecting to the EHR. But if you're going to require that connection, it's going to take time, and to expect adoption after that, or to go through the procurement process after that, is a wholly different set of criteria that the investigator who's the PI of the pilot or who's the driver of the pilot may not have connection to. But to your point, making sure that those are the right people is important. For everything else, devices, therapeutics, diagnostics, all of which we invest in, that's a pilot study is a far away from approval and something that Mayo Clinic would adopt.
So yeah, it's funny. As I'm listening to these conversations, it's probably a good example of just how investors are all human. So if you're going to come to me in your really early stage and you haven't had any interaction with the hospital system, then part of my due diligence process is if we can develop advocacy vis-a-vis a pilot in the system. If you've already piloted, you're coming to me saying, hey, how about an investment? I'm going to say, well, let's see if we can turn that into something more than a pilot. We're always going to move the goal line to whatever the next thing is. If you can't, if you've successfully completed the pilot and you're not, without ambiguity moving towards something more material, then immediately as an investor I'm thinking, well, what's wrong with it? Or what's wrong with the product? Or maybe you can't close a deal, and all those things are...
You're probably making, not dissimilar from me, you're probably making judgment calls on that, on the capability of that entrepreneur if they haven't.
Undoubtedly. We're not only evaluating whether we think the technology has legs, we're also evaluating whether or not we think this entrepreneur can at least get the company to the next stage and, inspire people to give them money, inspire people to buy their product. And, we can't help but do it.
Want anything to add from the Heritage perspective?
No, I don't think so.
All right. So I want to turn to the audience and provide an opportunity for a little Q&A for the group here. Yes, sir.
I'm Gary Sarfin. So you mentioned incentivize pilots and the champion at the hospitals, incentivize first to be a good doctor and publish and all that stuff. But sort of turning it around, how are you guys incentivized at the... So what is a successful year? I think for Lauren, it sounds like it's more of a traditional fund where maybe perhaps just on pure returns. But what would it take for your employers to say, wow, that was a spectacular year, Brent? Or what is it each year? So what's on the matrix on an annual basis that you guys are judging us? Because I think that'll answer a lot of questions for everybody as to how you guys view it, because that's one lens that you guys view it through.
So at Mount Sinai, it's financial, that the strategic aspect is happening, that we're supposed to be picking companies to invest in that are really, really helpful for our core mission of our institution, but that also make money.
Those are not mutually exclusive things. I will fight people to the death on that point. You can actually invest in things that are strategic, that are institutional grade investments.
And to Eric's point, we see hundreds of deals I'm making maybe 4, 5 a year, it's possible to find the overlap in that Venn diagram.
But how do you measure strategic?
It's measured for me. No. My board is the C-suite of the institution. When I'm bringing deals through the investment committee, they're saying, gee, I'm trying to think of a good example of something that we looked at recently. That I won't embarrass myself too heavily. Things with fetal medicine are really tricky. And it was clear that nobody was comfortable yet making any sort of investment in anything that was impacting fetal medicine because the risks are just too high.
For us, it's financial as well, particularly with the venture co-investment fund. We expect to be in the top quartile for the class. Otherwise, we're not going to get another fund. So we just got informal approval for our 4th fund, which should be
Congratulations.
north of the 3rd fund, which was 100 million. But
Wow.
yeah, so.
You guys are so sophisticated.
But for our smaller funds, it also is financial for those, although the runway is a bit longer, and we're looking to increase our royalty revenue as well, not just investment on the equity, but how does that impact, potential sales on future products?
So, go ahead.
Oh, or sure. I was just going to say, for us, it is financial, but the other side of it is, we are one of many healthcare private equity funds. And so our strategic LP base is, very strategic, to us, and it's a differentiator in the market. And so one area where we measure ourselves on is how are we able to leverage those strategic relationships for our portfolio companies. So that number that I mentioned of 60 customer contracts that we've signed between our portfolio companies and our LPs, that's something that we track every quarter, and we have a scorecard in terms of the pilots or, things that are in procurement. How have they moved through the pipeline over the course of the quarter? And we really do judge ourselves on that, each year, of how much value are we able to provide to our portfolio companies because of our LP relationships. But it's mainly financial, but it's
So I'll give you just one example of how, by the way, early or like pre-seed or accelerator investments. It is really difficult to sort of measure in the near term financial returns. Although accretion of value is likely dwindling. We invested a certain price, and then within 3 months we have an up round, right? And that's everybody does that, and we can't help but do it. But that's not the same thing as having liquidity. But here's an example of having both. So made an investment in a health IT company focused on, streamlining prior authorization in the molecular diagnostics space. We were losing millions in revenue, just not billing because the process was just too difficult for our lab. And so by employing the service hub, it's found money. It's $2 million that found me a $500,000 investment and making $2 million additional revenue to the hospital system because we just threw up our hands because it was just too complicated for us. And so, good strategic fit. By the way, genomics, molecular diagnostics are an important area of growth for our hospital system. So, double check on the strategic side. But now the company's turning around. So I get in, at a sub $5 million valuation. It's raising money on a $15+ million valuation about 6 months later.
Right, wow.
Right?
Very
So,
impressive.
all around that one, I got money. I'm not kidding. But that's an example of really sort of checking off the boxes.
So from the din in the hallway here, I'm gathering that our session has ended.
Right.
I want to thank all of my esteemed colleagues here on the panel. Such an amazing opportunity to have such a broad perspective from across the country. There's an unbelievably sophisticated investment institutions. I know some of us will be able to hang around and answer questions one-on-one. Thank you to the Redefining Early Stage Investment Conference and for all of you.